Africa today is a continent of 54 countries, a varied landscape, peoples and languages. But they're all united by a history of fighting foreign subjugation. It's difficult to cover a crucial period of the African story in one episode, so these are just a few highlights of African resistance and liberation. The struggle for independence was mostly won through peaceful and organized mass resistance, demonstrations, strikes, and political rallies. But sometimes Africans had to resort to arms in the face of discrimination, oppression, and bloody crackdowns by European colonial powers or white settlers. At the dawn of the colonial era in 1870, most of Africa was still in the hands of the Africans themselves. But increasingly there were more confrontations with European imperial powers, notably Britain and France, as they laid claim to African land. Dr. Kenneth Ombongi is one of Kenya's leading historians, and his expertise spans many eras. He provides the commentary throughout this program. Dr. Ombongi says a common feature of colonialism is that it always seeks to dominate.
That intrinsic tenet of imperialism is actually the fundamental reason why the Africans resisted it. People are resisting the alienation from their cultural, social roots. The bottom line was that the colonial system was totally oppressive.
And Africans fought against these oppressors. One of the last survivors of the Mau Mau movement in Kenya tells us why he joined the resistance.
That is because the European settlers were treating us like animals in the land of Kenya.
I take up position in Kenya's Rift Valley to bring you a snapshot of some of the highlights of Africans' resistance, starting with the northeast of the continent. Between 1880 and 1914, resistance in northeast Africa led to the loss of many thousands of lives in battles against European forces. Resistance here was not only inspired by nationalist sentiment, but also by religious faith. These men in a suburb of the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, are seeking a higher state of spirituality at a weekly gathering. Islam has strong roots in Sudan, and this gave rise to one of Africa's most charismatic religious leaders, Muhammad Ahmed al-Mahdi. In 1885, he famously defeated the British general Charles Gordon in Khartoum. The British wanted control of Sudan to consolidate their hold on neighboring Egypt. I go to Khartoum, where I was born, to meet the Mahdi's grandson, who tells me why that victory was so significant.
For the whole of Africa, it represented the most successful resistance movement to imperialism at the time. He was no doubt an inspired person and an inspirational person too. There was total Sudanese support of the movement because he really expressed the aspirations of the people.
This is the tomb where the Mahdi is buried, and it is one of the best-known historic landmarks in the whole of Sudan. After the death of the Mahdi, it fell to his successors to maintain Sudan's sovereignty and independence. But their efforts were not so successful, and they met with defeat at a major battle here in Omdurman. The British, led by General Kitchener, avenged the death of Gordon at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898.
I think what the British did was, in General Kitchener's terms, kind of vindictive campaign.
Like the Mahdi in Sudan, Sayyid Muhammad Abdullah Hassan in Somalia also derived authority from religion. He fought a 20-year war against the British and Italians and gave them this warning.
If you wish war, I am happy. If you wish peace, I am also content. But if you wish peace, go away from my country to your own. If you wish war, stay where you are.
Muhammad Abdullah Hassan is known as the father of Somali nationalism. Neighbouring Somalia is Ethiopia, a country with a royal dynasty dating back many hundreds of years. Ethiopia has staved off numerous attempts to subdue it by both the British and the Italians, like at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. This is the town of Adwa today, and indeed, the battle is still a source of great pride for the people here and for all Ethiopians. But the Battle of Adwa's significance is more than just military. It is symbolic of how the Ethiopians resisted European domination, and indeed, Ethiopia is the only country in Africa that has never been colonized. Had Ethiopia been defeated at Adwa, it could have become an Italian colony like Eritrea next door. As I wander around Asmara, the capital of Eritrea, I admire the Art Deco buildings and layout designed by the Italians during their rule. And if you go to the Eritrean Red Sea port city of Massawa, you can see the ruins of the palace where the former Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie spent his holidays. During his reign from 1930 to 1974, Haile Selassie was for many Africans an important advocate of independence. The emperor's granddaughter remembers him.
My grandfather, the emperor, was a great influence. My grandfather, the Emperor Haile Selassie, would make sure when he visited schools, he would take us with him. When he hospitals, he would take us. In fact, he also showed us how to treat people equally, so we are not isolated from the society.
Staying in East Africa, one of the first large-scale movements of resistance to colonial rule was against the Germans in Tanganyika, in what later became Tanzania. This was known as the Maji Rebellion.
On the onset of colonialism in East Africa from 1895 onwards, virtually every community responded to the encroachment of the colonial authorities. Some responded according to the dictates of the environment they were in, but they had been reduced to a level where they can not resist a mighty power that had the advantage of a gun. Others gave armed resistance, and the classic example we can think of in Eastern Africa is the Maji rebellion in Tanganyika against the Germans. The Germans created an oppressive system where they used local agents to literally force the local people to work in extensive farms that were beginning to emerge.
However, along with many examples of resistance, there were also instances of negotiation, even collaboration, with European colonialists. The Kingdom of Buganda, in what is today Uganda, allied itself with the British in the last decade or so of the 19th century because the king, or Kabaka, Mwanga II, saw that their interests aligned.
In a sense, Buganda, to a large extent, became the base from which the colonial authorities in Uganda extended their rule to other parts of the country, either using the Buganda chiefs as colonial agents, or who then extended their rule to other parts of the country on behalf of the British. I think for quite a number of the ethnic groups in Uganda, there's a bit of hostility against that, and also later on people looking at Buganda as being favored by the British. But in some places, this seemed to elevate the Buganda vis-a-vis the other groups.
In historical discourse, this is what we call collaboration of local social groups and individuals with the colonialists, especially when they came in the very beginning. I want to believe, and fairly strongly, that did not mean that they supported foreign domination.
In West Africa, there were some alliances with the colonial powers, but most rulers opted for armed resistance against them. In modern-day Senegal in West Africa, there was one illustrious example of resistance against the French from the late 19th century. Lat Dior was from a ruling dynasty in a Wolof state which had endured for centuries. He died fighting the French at the Battle of Dekele in 1886. His legendary horse, Malau, is forever immortalized in this giant statue in the capital, Dakar. Also in West Africa, in Côte d'Ivoire, President Alassane Ouattara talks about his pride at being descended from Sékou Ouattara, the Emperor of Congo, who fought the French in the early 1700s.
Well, Sékou Ouattara was emperor of Congo. Congo was an empire, but the empire went from Mali all the way to Togo. It covered part of Côte d'Ivoire, of course, or Burkina, Ghana, and Togo. You'll see that you have Ouattaras from Mali all the way to Togo. It was an industrial sector, arts and crafts, but also religion. The mosque is very, very well known. Many people used to go there for pilgrimage. They say that if you go to pray in Congo on a Friday, whatever you wish happens. And it's true, because I went to pray there when I was in the opposition, and 2 years later I was elected.
You refute the idea then that some historians of the colonial era have, that the Africans welcomed the colonial powers with open arms.
No,
there was real resistance.
No, that's not true. We fought them. No. In Congo, Samori Touré fought them, and Sékou Ouattara fought the colonialists. So I'm very proud to be a descendant of Sékou Ouattara. I wish I could be an emperor. It would be much better than being president.
Those who fought the colonial powers were regarded as heroes by Africans. But for Europeans, they were seen as a force that had to be defeated. At times, the violence used was extreme. One especially tragic example is the fate of the Herero and Nama people in what is today Namibia in southern Africa. In 1914, the Germans killed tens of thousands of them in retribution for an uprising. Some were killed outright, many were left to starve to death.
It becomes a little bit difficult to isolate each colonial power and say this was less atrocious than the other. The example of the Germans in Namibia and the literal extermination of the Herero people is a classic example of what a number of colonial powers did in and around Africa. Typical of what a colonial force can do when it is faced by resistance from the people who refuse to be dominated.
Across the continent, resistance was met by defeat and European occupation. This came early in North Africa. Algeria, which had been ruled by the Ottomans, fell to the French in the first part of the 19th century. Within 60 years, the rest of North Africa was subjugated. At the turn of the 20th century, all of Africa was in the hands of the Europeans, except Ethiopia and Liberia, the country created for emancipated slaves. However, the drive for independence could not be extinguished and soon gained momentum with the onset of the World Wars.
The First World War was, I think, one of the most significant ingredients in generating the initial nationalistic sentiments in a number of colonies in Africa. In Eastern Africa, the Africans fight along the British soldiers, the King's African rivals. When they come back, the war is ended. The colonial government in Nairobi decided to reward the British ex-soldiers with the land. They didn't do so to the Africans. I'm very sure that the question of discrimination became open at that point in time. And then the economic structure, the economic social structure that comes subsequent to the First World War is one that put the Africans at the lowest echelon of the society, both economically and socially.
But there was also a drive by the colonial authorities after the First World War to encourage education amongst the locals so that they could perform administrative and clerical duties in the colonial administration.
True, encourage education. But colonial education was basically an imperial tool to prepare the Africans to be subjects of the empire. It was expedient. It was very well framed to produce a subservient African who would serve the interests of the colonial regime and the dynamics that came with it. That is why, all the way up to the 1940s, 1950s, the Africans were actually having access to basic rudimentary education. The Second World War, more or less like the First World War, provided a forum where an African and a white settler could share in the battlefront, share in the sufferings that came with fighting the enemies of empire at the time. The African carrier corps, who were very common during the Second World War, those who fought in the battlefront, came to realize that indeed these are people like us. They have their fears, they have their interests. And we are fighting in the same cause now. And it created a situation where there were expectations that after this, we will be granted our rights as human beings just like them.
The international climate had also changed after World War II. The independence of India in 1947 stiffened the resolve of the Africans. And Europe was weaker and the United States was opposed to the imperial project.
America decides that it was not to their national interest for the British, the French, the Germans to continue having their colonies across the continent. Not because they loved Africa, I guess, not because they were magnanimous, but because of their interests and the emergence of independent India. Other colonial territories thought that if India has made it, we can also make it.
Ideology also played its part in boosting and uniting Africans in their actions to gain independence. There were strong ideas and theories of black empowerment, negritude and Pan-Africanism defined by African intellectuals on the continent and also in the diaspora. One of the main proponents of negritude was the first president of Senegal, Leopold Senghor. I meet his nephew, Racine Senghor, in the capital, Dakar.
Et cette notion de négritude était une manière de montrer les valeurs de civilisation du monde noir. Rappelez-vous que la colonisation était fondée sur le fait que les Africains n'étaient pas civilisés et qu'il fallait leur apporter la civilisation. C'est la fameuse mission civilisatrice. Mais les Senghor et autres ont commencé par montrer que non, l'Afrique a des valeurs de civilisation. Et ils ont tout fait pour montrer ces valeurs. D'ailleurs, leur création littéraire, cette création littéraire est inspirée fondamentalement par les formes artistiques africaines. Mais au-delà de cela, c'est affirmer son identité culturelle et se projeter dans le monde.
After the break, we see how Africans won their struggle for liberty and how colonial rule was almost completely ended by the mid-20th century. The bonds of solidarity between Africans seeking independence had deep roots in a movement known as Pan-Africanism. The late Nigerian Afrobeat legend Fela Kuti was a big advocate of Pan-Africanism, which states that unity amongst all people of African descent is vital to progress. His son, Seun Kuti, meets me at the former family home in Lagos, which is now a cafe and museum dedicated to Fela Kuti's memory, with plenty of pictures of him on display.
My father used to always say, Africa will unite. He didn't say must. He used to say, he said when he was younger, he said, Africa must unite. But he realized that it's the will of the people. So Africa will unite. That was his own vision, because he believed that we as Africans, we share a common energy that, if can be just channeled towards our own growth and our own development, we can really achieve a lot for ourselves.
This shared ambition for independence propelled nationalist movements right across the continent. There were widespread demonstrations and political rallies, though some also resisted through the use of force, like the Mau Mau in Kenya. In the late 1940s, Kenyan nationalists, mostly from the Kikuyu ethnic group, formed the Mau Mau, an organization that took arms against the British, who responded in a brutal and bloody manner. In 1952, many of the rebels were imprisoned. I meet one of the last surviving leaders of the Mau Mau uprising at his home just outside Nairobi, Gitu Wakahengari. He was imprisoned along with his father for 7 years in the 1950s. What inspired you to join the Mau Mau resistance?
Because we want to remove the dictatorship and subjugation. That is because the European settlers were treating us like animals in the land of Kenya.
What happened to you? Were you treated like that
Yes,
personally?
of course. I saw them beating my father in front of his wife, my mother. I saw him taking us to go and work for the European farms without being paid anything.
Why was your father beaten by the European farmers in front of your mother?
For no reasons at all, because they want to beat them. They want to beat the Africans. They were saying even when they were speaking to us that your children are no children. Instead of brain, they have polish in their heads. That kind of abuse.
There were those who said that the Mau Mau used very violent means in order to gain their freedom.
What means? If you go to war, do you choose where you are going to hate your enemy? Do you choose? You hate your enemy wherever the bullet goes. And that is what they were doing.
There were huge, many examples of human rights abuses against the Mau Mau and so on. Give us an example of the kind of mistreatment, torture even, at the hands of the British, and were you yourself a victim of that?
For a Mau Mau leader like me, I was given a job for a strategist during the Mau Mau struggle movement. Like me, when I was detained, it was a routine that every morning I must be beaten from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock. And then I can go for my uji, porridge. We can go take it after I have been beaten thoroughly well.
What was the nature of the beating?
Any weapon that they find, the djembe handles and all that.
What's a djembe?
Djembe handle is a hoe.
A hoe?
Hoe handle.
They'd hit you with farming tools.
Many of them. That is what they used to beat us with.
And where would they beat you?
Anywhere.
Legs?
Leg, buttocks, head, all the parts of your body. Women. These women were also sometimes raped. Sometimes they inserted hot water bottles into their private parts. What can you call savage other than doing that kind of thing to other human beings? This is what the treatment they give us all the time. That is what happened. And therefore, we sacrificed everything of us that we go to that war to drive them out of Kenya.
Much has been written about Africans' struggle for freedom, like the Mau Mau. But this series is based on UNESCO's General History of Africa, the GHA, which brings the continent's history from the perspective of its own people. The General History of Africa says there has been a tendency to describe those Africans who did not resist colonial rule as peace-loving and those who did fight as bloodthirsty. It says there was resistance to Europeans in virtually every region in Africa where they were present. The rebellions were just wars of liberation, which is why they were supported by the overwhelming majority of Africans.
The very interesting dichotomy between those who resisted and those who did not resist is fairly misleading in my view, because response to an encouraging colonial regime can either be by confrontation or can be by co-option. Of course, you cannot rule out the fact that the arrangement of colonialism, there are some African groupings who saw it as an opportunity for advancement. But the point is, colonialism means the same and one thing. It alienates, it dominates, and it controls. Even the people who purportedly benefited from it were literally alienated, dominated, and controlled.
The Mau Mau of Kenya inspired many freedom fighters across Africa. But there is a struggle for liberty that remains one of the most destructive in the history of Africa, the War of Independence in Algeria. By 1935, most of the Maghreb states of North Africa had fallen mostly to France. In fact, the French had captured Algeria as early as 1830, which goes a long way to explaining why the Algerian War for Independence was the bloodiest on the continent. The statue of Mustafa bin Boulaid. He's known as the father of the Algerian Revolution against the French. This is his hometown of Batna in eastern Algeria. Bin Boulaid was a rich businessman who used his wealth to arm the resistance against the French in 1954. He died 2 years later and never saw Algeria win its freedom.
The local people were marching in terms of playing a key role in the decision-making process in politics, in economics, and in society generally. That is really what sparks off the local people organizing and coming up with the National Liberation Front.
I make my way to the capital, Algiers, to meet one man who remembers the period of French rule.
كانوا الجزائريين عايشين في الدرجة 10 ماشي في الدرجة الثانية ولا الثالثة. كان الجزائري ما عنده حق في حتى حاجة، ما عندنا حق في والو. هاي ليك المعاملة اللي عملتنا بها فرنسا. عولا مسدس وهما كانوا عندهم طيارات وكان عندهم نظام وكانت عندهم حاجة. هما العسكري يعني الجندي لما يكمل لاباتروي يروح للكازيرنا ينام. واسمها الكازيرنا بالعربية تاكانا يروح يرقد. والمجاهد مسكين لما يحبس الكروشاج يلزم له يقطع الواد مشمخ ويبات مشمخ. يعني الفرق كان كبير. وحنا لحقنا اللي باش نحينا وجبناها هذيك الاستقلال هذيك يعني ان بري فور سومه غاليه. خلصنا الغالي، خلصناها غاليه. احنا فرنسا ما عطاتناش الاستقلال كما يقولوا، عطاونا الاستقلال. احنا دينا الاستقلال، ما عطاوناش، احنا ديناها الاستقلال والحمد لله.
By the mid-20th century, the forces of nationalism and resistance were too great for the Europeans to overcome, and Africa began to gain its independence, starting with Libya in 1951, followed in rapid succession by Egypt in 1952, Sudan, Morocco and Tunisia in 1956, and Ghana in 1957. Jamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt's charismatic leader, was one of the main advocates of Pan-Africanism and indeed arranged the marriage of an Egyptian Christian woman, Fathia, to Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah. Ghana's path to independence was based on the peaceful mass movement he led against the British, but Nkrumah lost power within a decade. Kwame Nkrumah was deposed in a military coup in 1966 when he was on a mission to the Far East. He was offered asylum by President Sékou Touré in Guinea, and he remained there until his death in 1972. It wasn't until the 1980s that Nkrumah's body was repatriated and buried here in this magnificent marble mausoleum surrounded by fountains. When in 2007 his wife Fathia died, she was buried alongside him, and the inscription on her tombstone says, "Beloved wife of a great man, she faced adversity with courage." Samia is one of Kwame Nkrumah's 3 children with Fathia.
He was a man of the people. He moved all over the country, setting up bases. So he was a good organizer. I guess he gauged the mood of the country, of the people, that they were impatient for change. He was the man of the moment, the catalyst, I would say, for our independence. But as he said, many people were part of this movement, many, including women, particularly women, who were great supporters of the movement, of the party eventually formed. They financed it. And I'm not talking only about intellectual women, but even traders, women from all walks of life.
Well, it's very important you raise that, actually, because obviously the post-colonial first leaders of Africa are all men. And to this day, we've not got a very good record on female presidents in Africa. However, that doesn't mean that they were not instrumental in the nationalist movements.
In fact, and he always used to say, no significant change can happen without the full involvement and participation of women. So he has this radical statement, and it's in one of his books, and it goes something like, you can measure the degree of a country's revolutionary awareness by the political maturity of its women.
'60 was a landmark year for Africa. 17 countries won their independence throughout these 12 months, including Nigeria. Freedom Park in Lagos is a welcome refuge from the hustle and bustle of city life. And there are also busts and statues to some of the most iconic figures in modern-day Nigeria. This wasn't always a place of greenery and serenity, because in fact, Freedom Park was established on the grounds of Her Majesty's prison. And later, some of the best-known figures of people agitating for independence were actually imprisoned here, like Herbert Macaulay. One former MP meets me at Freedom Park and shares his memories of Nigeria's Day of Independence.
All of us as young men were in joyous mood, but the real significance of it did not dawn on us at that time. But we know that it was one event which spread throughout the country. Of course, we were in Lagos there, which was the capital. We felt the impact more than perhaps any other place in the country.
Was it a moment of great hope and expectation for you?
Of course, we felt the sky is the limit.
But blue, clear skies soon gave way to grey realities, and the peace and prosperity Africans had aspired to proved elusive. Africa was free, but external powers still exerted influence. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union meant each side armed its supporters, creating instability in Africa. A striking example is the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the fate of its first Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba. Businessman Francois Lumumba is the son of Patrice Lumumba, and he lives with his family in Kinshasa, the capital of the DRC. He explains how his father was caught up in the Cold War and assassinated in 1961 by his political rivals, including the army chief Mobutu Sese Seko, who later seized power and became one of Africa's notorious dictators. The plot to kill Patrice Lumumba was backed by the Americans and Belgium, the former colonial power.
Ici, avec la différence, avec les autres qui voudraient l'indépendance toute court, indépendance. Mais Lumumba, il voudrait l'indépendance avec l'indépendance politique et l'indépendance économique. Et c'est là, les Belges, qu'ils ont senti que Lumumba, il veut leur priver de leurs privilèges. Leurs privilèges, alors d'où ils ont fait tout pour affaiblir le gouvernement Lumumba. Nous avons vu ça. Et qu'en le traitant qu'il est des communistes, qu'il est proche avec les soviétiques, ce qui n'était pas... Il a réussi de mobiliser les masses populaires. Le peuple, ils ont senti que Lumumba, c'est le sauveur, qui vont sortir dans la situation là où il s'est retrouvé, qu'ils ont senti aussi qu'il n'est pas tribaliste. Il veut le Congo uni, indépendant, tout ça, et les gens, ils étaient extrêmement sensibles à ce genre de situation.
Francois Lumumba was 10 years old when his father was killed.
C'était dramatique et non pas dramatique, parce que là, on a vécu comment que Lumumba, il était appuyé, aimé dans tout le monde, parce que sa mort, que nous, on n'a jamais cru qu'il était, disons, assassiné, il va s'en sortir, tout, etc. Mais ça nous a fait le choc. Comme tous les enfants, on était fiers que nous sommes ses enfants. Et jusqu'au bout, et quand tu vois même, quand on l'a assassiné, il n'a jamais été à genoux, il n'a jamais pleuré, il a toujours gardé ses ennemis en face.
Independence in Africa may have brought its own challenges, such as in the Congo, but that did not dampen the will and desire for liberty. By the 1970s, all of Africa was free from colonial rule, except for a handful of states in southern Africa. Their history was different because of the dominance of white settlers. The last country to become free of white rule was South Africa, when Nelson Mandela became president in 1994. It had been a long struggle, and Mandela paid a heavy personal price, locked up for 27 years in this prison cell on Robben Island, following a sham trial in the capital, Pretoria. This is the Palace of Justice, where the famous Rivonia trial took place in Pretoria in 1963 to 64. And at the end of that trial, Nelson Mandela and others were sentenced to life imprisonment. It wasn't until nearly 30 years later that he was released, and of course, as they say, the rest is history. To paraphrase the title of Mandela's autobiography, it has been a long walk to freedom for Africa. And colonialism has left an indelible mark on the continent. The colonial legacy still generates much debate today. Those who believe it was an unmitigated disaster and brought nothing but underdevelopment for Africa are perhaps overstating the case. But nor was it an unqualified blessing for Africa. UNESCO's General History of Africa says the evidence shows that economic exploitation far outweighed economic development. And so, on balance, it says that the colonial era is a period of growth without development, a period of lost opportunities, and of humiliation for the peoples of Africa.
Largely, I would agree with the assessment that colonialism was more of a liability than an asset to post-colonial Africa. We survived the slavery and slave trade. We survived colonialism. We are surviving the post-colonial tendencies that seem to subjugate us more than support the development of this continent. This is a history that gives hope. Talks about the resilience of the African race. We have made it in the past, and the young people in the continent need to know that we have what it takes to survive future challenges and create a better Africa than it is today.
Africa is the 21st century's youngest continent, and yet it has the oldest history in the world. I hope that this series has gone some way to bringing you Africa's history, told and interpreted by the people of the continent themselves. And I finish with the words of the Kenyan Nobel laureate, the late human rights and environmental activist, Wangari Maathai. You cannot enslave a mind that knows itself, that values itself, that understands itself. Thank you for watching this series, The History of Africa, with me, Zeinab Badawi. I hope you've learned from it as much as I have.